What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
And this is a live episode with our members and previous guests on the podcast joining us live and not in person on Zoom. There will be no spoilers because we're not talking about a specific book, but we won't spoil any book you haven't read today. That's not part of the agenda.
Ooh, I hope not. We're going to be answering some listener questions, and Rebecca is going to take it away.
Heck yeah. So we're going to start off with what I feel like is the most appropriate. 2 years ago, you guys made a decision to start a podcast together. What brought you to that decision?
So I guess I'll start. On my end, I had done a podcast in college, a very small 2-episode little shindig for a project. And I was like, that was really fun. And then I kind of put that away and didn't touch it for a little while. And then fast forward, I was working here in Chicago in a marketing role where I felt like I got to exercise my creativity, but pretty much all my creative energy was going into work. And I know that was something Julia had been feeling too. And one day, I don't know if I was in the shower or on the train or what, but I know I rolled into the kitchen and I was like, Julia, I have an idea. What if we made a podcast about books?
My microphone just collapsed on itself. Yeah, it was completely out of the blue, but it was like, I could tell she'd been thinking about it for a long time because it was like a fully fledged idea. She was like, I've been thinking about it a lot and I really think we should do it together. And my understanding is part of the motivation was that like she knew she would keep doing it if I were also there, you know, that kind of accountability and like, oh, well, I have to make it because Julia is expecting me to make it this week, which honestly works because there are sometimes I think it would not get made if we weren't doing it together. Yeah, and then I was like, this is the best idea you've ever had. Let us go immediately sit down and forget whatever dinner I was eating and start outlining what books we want to do. And we had full copy and Google Docs done by the end of the night. It was serendipitous.
Yeah, it was one of those like brainchilds where you're like, if we don't put deadlines on this, I'm sure we said this to each other, like if we don't make a deadline, this isn't happening.
Yeah.
I think at the time, Rebecca was our roommate as well. And she came home and we're like, so we're starting a podcast. We have a 3-month plan to roll this out. Do you have any recommendations? Books we should talk about? And now it's full circle because Rebecca's on the team too.
Yeah.
It is absolutely crazy to believe that it's been a whole 2 years. Well,
Yeah.
We're all really happy that you did make that decision, if I could speak for everybody here. What other podcasts do you guys enjoy listening to and maybe, I might add, influence the way that you podcast?
I saw that question get submitted and I was pretty excited. I love talking about other podcasts. There was a certain phase of the pandemic, particularly when I was unemployed, where I had like a podcast of the day. So like on Mondays, I knew this one podcast came out called Self-Helpless that I absolutely love. So I listened to Self-Helpless every Monday, and like every Wednesday, I think it was like Pete Holmes, You Made It Weird. Those are probably my 2 like longtime listener podcasts. But right now I've been enjoying listening to a new podcast out by, I think it's Pushkin is the group that makes it. It's called A Slight Change of Plans, and it's hosted by a woman named Maya, and I'm forgetting her last name right now. And her background is in psychology, and yeah, every episode she talks with someone about their like a pivotal life change moment. So I really enjoy podcasts where people talk about their lives as well as like things they're passionate about. So when it's like the crossover of like, this is an interesting thing that happened in my life, plus like, here's my career journey or my personal journey. Like I really love that stuff.
Yeah. You like deep things and I listen to like stupid shit. So, no, I mean, not all of it, but some of it. I would say the 2 most, I listen to so many podcasts, but if I want to think about the influential ones that taught me what kind of podcast I wanted to make, How Did This Get Made is one of the OG podcasts out there. It's Paul Scheer, Jason Mantzoukas, June Diane Raphael, like comedian nerd friends sit down. They've been doing this for like 10 years and they talk about really bad movies. And it's just friendship, you know, and a lot of what I have learned I love about podcasts I figured out from that show. Yeah, and I feel like listening through their catalog as well and saw how they grew and how their show adapted over time and they became more comfortable and more ridiculous taught me a lot. And then I think a podcaster that we're both deeply indebted to is Science Mike. He doesn't even go by that anymore, but we still call him
Mike
that.
McHargue. I know. I can't believe when it was like, what are the most influential podcasts? I was like,
You
let me
didn't
think.
mention
It's like,
him.
I can't believe. Yeah. Yes, Mike McHargue is a great podcaster.
He's made a few. His current one is the Cozy Robot Show, which I would highly recommend. But yeah, he's gotten us through the pandemic for sure, and taught me a lot. He's very good at. He's also autistic, and he explains exactly what's going through his head while he's making a show, and that's been very helpful for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say I really appreciate his openness of like, as he's created the Cozy Robot Show with his team and like how it's evolved, and like he'll like straight up talk about like, yeah, we tried this and we realized it wasn't really working, or we tried to define what we're doing and it was kind of hard. They're very intentional about sharing that kind of stuff, which the podcaster in me really enjoys, knowing that this person who's a professional and done this for years is still learning and figuring things out. But I'm also not someone to sit down and listen to like podcasting tech, like podcasts that are just about podcasting, if that makes sense. So I like that he like weaves it in. But anyways, we could go forever on this question. I think,
yes,
Rebecca, you can move us along.
Once you guys got started, once you got past the initial idea and you were doing it for a little while, had a few episodes in, was there something that kind of really took you by surprise about either the process or what you enjoyed about podcasting?
We had a major kind of transitional period this past spring where we really sat down and were like, okay, we're approaching 2 years. If we want to keep doing this, we need to like really evaluate what it is we actually like about this. Why are we making it? Like, how are we going to make this long term? That kind of thing. And we sort of both had this discovery because we were like, well, we're just doing this for fun. But we had the discovery that like the thing that we find fun is like self-improvement and like learning new things and like becoming better at a craft. I never imagined myself as a sound engineer, but now I'm like kind of obsessed with it. And it took like a whole year and a half for me to become the official sound engineer. And now I'm like, I can't imagine making this without like doing all the editing myself. And so, yeah, I think that kind of light bulb moment of like, we really enjoy the nitty gritty and the process, and we like constantly improving our sound and constantly, improving our conversations and our analysis and like everything, which is not exactly like playground kind of fun, but it's definitely been a fun discovery for me, I think.
Yeah, Varun, who was on this meeting, was the one who told me if you're just doing it for fun, like you wouldn't have to sit around, you wouldn't have to do all this work. Like if it was just fun to sit and talk about books, you wouldn't like, why did you turn on the mic? Why do you record it? Why do you share it with people? And I'm like, these are great questions. Because like, oh, we're just doing it for fun. It's like, we could also just sit on our couch and talk about books for fun because we used to live together. So yes, that was like a big pivotal change of like, why are we doing this? I think one thing that I was reflecting on recently that I'm surprised by, but also not surprised by, is that like mine and Julia's friendship has been very, like this has been a really great thing for our friendship that we get to do it together and collaborate on. And I think there's probably some subconscious level that we knew we would work well together. We had previously both worked freelance for like the same person before, so we were kind of like a team. We had some experience collaborating in like a more professional setting, but otherwise like this could have been a terrible idea. Like, you know, like if we went like totally different directions with it, or if I was like, no, Julia, we have to sell out and get all these ads because we like, I mean, no. Julia would have been like, I'm done. I am not promoting some random product I don't care about.
Yeah.
So like the fact that we can just like kind of come together, and our disagreements tend to be things that are less about a disagreement, but more like, let's reconfirm like why we want to do something, or like, let's figure out the best approach to do it together. So yeah, that was like a fun surprise along the way. It's like, oh, not only are we like good friends who have similar interests, but like we work really, really well together.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the Enneagram 3 and 8, isn't that like the power couple?
Yeah.
I can vouch for that.
It's been true.
Okay, next question. If you could ascribe one of the books that you've read on the podcast to your personality, which one would it be?
Yeah, this question came in from Kayla.
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is such a Kayla question.
Oh, so ascribe a book we've read that's most my personality.
Yeah,
Is that the question? Yeah. Okay.
I'm literally going to go through our episode list right now. I've forgotten every single book.
This is how
we've ever
unprepared
read.
I was for these questions.
I mean, it depends on what part of my personality I want to go with. Like, my sort of childhood, teenagerhood favorite book ever we've done on the show, Marcus Zusak's I Am the Messenger, or just called Messenger in Australia. Shout out Australia. That one still holds up to this day. I'm literally taking it with me to Belgium. It's on my floor right now. So, like, that book's gonna be with me till I die. I don't know if it matches my personality, but my soul loves it. Or possibly Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, because that one I feel like is connected to my family as well. It's very much like a thing that my whole family loves. Or some of the autism books. I don't know. I could keep going, but I'll end with I Am the Messenger by Marcus Zusak. Final answer. Ding, ding, ding.
Okay, so it's interesting. You went straight for all the fiction. My mind went straight to the nonfiction because I was thinking like which books have been like so influential in my worldview or personality that I don't realize that's where it came from. Mm-hmm. So the three that come up is Scary Close by Donald Miller. We covered this on the podcast quite a while ago. I think it was like maybe season 2. Yeah. And it's one of those books that I read at a very formative time in like my college years that really shaped my mindset around a lot of issues. And we talk about it in the episode where like, oh, these are things that we may or may not agree with fully anymore, or we don't particularly like his approach to some things, but it had to do with like relationships and how we understand each other. And like several people on this call and myself use metaphors from that book to describe like our friendships, our relationship, our middle pillows. Yes, thank you, Donald Miller. The second one that comes up is Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. I realized those episodes came out like almost back to back. We were like heavy on the relationship psychology right there. But yeah. I hadn't read that book before we did the episode, and it's still one that I like reference back and like we'll pick up and we're like, oh, what did she say again about this aspect of vulnerability? Or what did she say about like shame? Like there was a great quote or whatever. And then lastly, a recent one we've done, Smoke It's in Your Eyes. I think we probably talked for a solid 10 minutes of that episode about how much we didn't realize our ideas of death and dying are like tied to reading that book. Great question, Kayla. I'm gonna like ponder for a while because I feel like I took it a different direction than maybe the question intended.
Yeah, I feel like this whole podcast is kind of a manifestation of both of our personalities and worldviews, and because like we pull books that we've both read from our past. Like Scary Close is very much like a book that we shared when we were early college, deconstructing, doing all the things, right? Yeah, there's a lot of books that I'm like, that's like an old version of me, but it sort of tracks my whole self, my whole journey, I guess. And yeah. I'm kind of excited to see what we've got in like 5 years when suddenly it's like, you know, so many years of us learning and figuring out new things, and who knows what books are going to come out by then.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And a slight teaser for the next season. All of them are books that we haven't read before, except barring like one that Julia read previously. So it's like a new take because we literally have run out of books that we care to talk about that we've already read.
We've run out.
So we're
Yeah.
doing a lot more reading this next season.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. I think kind of similarly on that note of books that have changed you, what book would you say, I don't think it necessarily has to be one that you've talked about on the podcast, has changed your perspective the most, at least that you're aware of?
Yeah.
A book that has changed our perspective. Neurotribes was a big one. That was like a big kind of life-altering, world-shifting kind of seeing autism and disability from a historical perspective kind of completely reframed my understanding of my own history and myself and my place in it. That was pretty big. I'm sure there are more. Oh, as a kid, one of the first books that made me like love reading, that like took me through into adulthood, was the Inkheart trilogy by Cornelia Funke. I was obsessed with those. Oh my god. That's because I had been reading kind of just kids series up until that point, and that was the first time I think I read like a proper young adult novel, and I was like, oh, I like this. I'm gonna be a reader, you know? Yeah, those were huge.
Yeah, this one's hard. I can think about specific books that like really opened my eyes to things that I hadn't really thought about before. So like Neurotribes, again, a great like comprehensive history of autism and disability, and reading it with Julie and being able to discuss it. It was like one of our very first podcast episodes, was like really helpful too. And like because we were like, oh, we're going to do an episode and we're going to, you know, share this with other people, it like gave us an opportunity to sit down, and I was like, oh, I'm going to like write out some questions that I have or other people might have. And so like we just started having like more conversations about autism. And so yeah, that was a really formative one. I'm thinking like really recently I just finished reading And Then We Grew Up by Rachel Friedman.
It's a little teaser.
Yeah, that's coming up on the podcast. A nonfiction kind of memoir / journalistic book about creativity and potential. And the author had some parallels in her life similar to mine, as far as being really dedicated to music and then quitting and not really doing it at all, and kind of coming to terms with growing up and whether or not and in what form you like pursue creativity in your work or in your free time or both. So that one's been on my mind constantly. I think I've brought it up like every day the past like 2 weeks to someone.
And I just got it in the mail.
Nice.
So it's coming with me across the ocean, and I'm very excited to talk about it.
So I kind of want to dive into a little bit of how you guys decide what books you are going to feature on the podcast. I guess starting with specifically, we got a question. If you're unsure about a book that you're reading, how long do you give it? Do you have any like personal rules? I feel like readers tend to have that, like I will read 100 pages before I give up, or I will read 2 chapters or something like that. Do you guys have any of those?
I used to be, if I start a book, I finish a book kind of person, but had to give that up in college. I could not read all the books, and also realized like there's only so many hours in the day. Like why read books I don't care about or that don't resonate with me at a certain time? I think I give a book as long as it holds my attention or as long as I'm intrigued. A lot of times I'll leave a book in like a half read pile and then eventually visit that pile again and realize, okay, I'm not coming back to any of these books. And then like bless them on their journey as I give them away to someone else who might enjoy them more than I did. So I don't have any hard rules about it. But if it's something for the podcast, that's different. If Julie and I have decided like we are reading this book, I don't know if we've ever had a book that we completely took off the list. So if Julia said we're doing it, I'm reading it. But I feel like more often than not, it's Julia doesn't like the book and I did more than her picking a book that I don't like. Because I don't know, Julie gives good recommendations apparently.
Yeah. So far, I've only not finished like 2. I think I have the same policy. I'm very much the person of like, the book will kind of come to you when you're ready. I have picked up books, read the first chapter, been like, I can tell this is amazing and I am not ready for it. This is not for me right now, and I will leave it on my shelf until I am ready for it. And sometimes it'll be a couple months, sometimes it'll be 5 years later, and I'll pick it up and I'll be like, oh, I'm so glad I read this now. So I kind of just hoard books until they call me. So yeah, I I don't have like a specific rule, but it's more a kind of belief, you know? It's like if it's not holding me right now, it goes back on the shelf and we'll put a little bookmark and we'll come back to it. Because there have been some books that we've done on the podcast where like I had planned to read them a long time ago, or they'd been sitting on my shelf for like since college. And it was like, it's time. It's time to read this. So, yeah.
Awesome. Is there a book that you guys have wanted to do, or maybe like one of you has wanted to do and the other hasn't? For that reason, you haven't been able to do it, or for any other reason?
There's one coming up.
So a while back, we did the first book of the Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan series. So they're fiction series translated from Italian into English. They're very long books. Julia actually had the first one. I didn't want to do it. It was a definite judging a book by its cover moment. I was like, I don't understand. I don't want to read this. We read it on the podcast and it was really enjoyable. And then we were like, we'll get around to it. We'll get around to it. They're long books. Let's not push ourselves. I'm like, you know what? I picked it up like in May and I was like, I'm going to start it now. Give myself time. I read it in 4 days and I loved it. And I was like, I've been like waiting on Julia ever since. That's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. It's so funny to me now that like I was the one pushing us to do it. And now, oh, I know they're good. I know they're good. But it's so, the second one's like twice as long. And I'm just staring at it like, I don't know if I can do this. It feels like climbing Mount Everest. The last one took me a couple months to finish. Realistic historical fiction, as we've learned from Pachinko, is like really tough for me. And it's usually worth it. And I usually am like happy with it, but it's like a slog. And so yeah, that's kind of I'm gearing myself up. I have been for about 7 months now, gearing myself up to get to that book. So we could probably do one more question.
Yeah. So when you guys read a book, now is your whole perspective around like, would this make a good podcast episode? And are you thinking about it being on the podcast? And additionally, do you read books now that are like just for you, you know, or is it always kind of there and shaping what you're picking at the store?
I don't know if I can't totally untangle it. So I do think it's in the back of my mind when I pick up a book. I'm going to keep talking about And Then We Grew Up. This is an example where I wanted to read this book for me. I was having a day where I was literally just like, what is potential? Am I reaching my potential? Like, I like being creative, but do I need to like make creativity the center of my job? Or is it something I do on the side? Like, am I good at what I'm doing? Blah, blah. Existential crisis. And I literally was like, I'm going to go to the bookstore to like just emotionally cool off. And so I walked around the bookstore and I found this book about creativity and potential. And I was like, I need to read it. So I bought it on the spot. And in the back of my mind, when I started reading it, I was like, would Julia like this? Like, that's usually my question. Not like, do I want to talk about it on the podcast, but like, would I want to talk with Julia about it first? Because if it doesn't meet that criteria, then it's like, okay, we won't talk about the podcast. If it's a book that I really enjoyed, but I don't think I'm like super jazzed to do a whole episode on it, we'll drop it in like our recommendations or our like currently obsessed section of the podcast where we talk about things we're enjoying currently. So I think the rate at which we put out episodes, I am pretty much only reading for the podcast, though I try to sneak in like one book. I'm a multi-book reader. I don't know how everyone is. Some people are like one book at a time. I always have like 2 or 3 books on the burners as I'm going through them. So I try to keep like one that's not officially on the podcast list, but a lot of them do end up there. Also for logistics reasons, because we sit down and we're like, let's pick 10 books to read over the next 12 weeks. And it's helpful if at least one of us have already read it.
Mm-hmm. That question of would Julia like it or would Victoria like it, I think is really the guiding light. Or not even necessarily would Victoria like it. Sometimes I just want to know what you think about it. Like, because there have been some books I've suggested where I'm like, I don't think you'll like this, but I really want you to talk about it with me. And part of it is like, this podcast is basically a chance for me to talk about my special interests. And if I didn't have this outlet, I would be just kind of bursting at the seams, either furiously journaling or just monologuing to Victoria in the kitchen. Like it would come out of me in some way. And so I feel like the podcast has been a way of like channeling my, like all my book thoughts. And so I don't know that I necessarily make a distinction between book club books and personal books, because it's all just what is going to hold my attention. Like I physically can't make myself read something I don't want to read. And so if I can't read it, it's not going on the show. So yeah, it's more just like, what do I want to talk about with Victoria? Yeah, which is most books.
Yeah. And recently, as almost, I'm sure all of you know, book club members get the chance to suggest books, which we really enjoy. And we have a great list of suggestions that have come in from a couple people on this call. If you want to add more in, the more the merrier. You're not limited to just one recommendation. I will say, while every suggestion, like there's not been a suggestion yet that we said we don't want to read it. It's just been, when we make a season of 10 episodes, we try to do a mix of nonfiction and fiction, try to sprinkle in some poetry, and also just look up page count. Like we made the mistake, I think it was season 2 of the podcast, or season 3, where we had like multiple, like 300, 400 page books that we were trying to get through, and we're like, wait, this isn't enjoyable. We can't read this fast. So we do appreciate all your suggestions, and we hope to sprinkle in and get to as many as we can each season.
Absolutely.
It's always great too, especially as we're getting to the literal edges of our bookshelf. We have nothing else to suggest to each other. It's great to be able to get a list of like, oh, David suggests this one, Claire suggests this one. Like, let's pick 1 or 2 or 3.
Yeah. There's a lot of logistics that goes into making a season. Like, we're not just like, what do we feel like reading or what do we feel like talking about? Like, we go into kind of, do we have a good variety of authors? Do we cover all genres? Like, are our genres, genders, ethnicities, are they all balanced? Like, we want to make sure that we're not just on the same note for a whole season. Although apparently, as you pointed out, we did 2 personal relational psychology books back to back. So maybe we didn't do a great job. But yeah, so that's also part of it. Is there are books that I have suggested every single time we've sat down that have just like never made the cut for like logistical reasons.
Yeah, we'll have it. Like this last season, we're like, okay, let's just throw out everything we're thinking, and we like, okay, we've mentioned these 3 books every single time, but it's because it's just like another sad white woman, and we're like, we don't need more books.
I have so many of those.
Let's mix it up. Let's like, in the vein of our podcasts, like to explore new perspectives. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Because we are sad white women, so we need to branch out a little. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you to everybody who submitted questions.
Yes.
They were all really good.
These were
and thank
amazing
you
questions.
to Juliet and Victoria for your thoughtful answers, putting your heart and soul into it.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.